I still remember that morning like it was yesterday, how my life changed in a matter of minutes. I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just a routine drive to work, sipping my coffee, listening to some random morning talk show. I had no idea that by the end of that day my entire world would be flipped upside down. I was running late, so I may have been driving a little faster than usual, but nothing crazy. When the flashing lights appeared in my rearview mirror, I sighed. A simple speeding ticket, I thought. Annoying, but nothing to freak out about. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and waited for the officer. He approached, hand resting on his holster like I was some kind of threat. I greeted him with a calm, "Good morning, officer," but he just grunted, asked for my license and registration, the usual routine. Then, out of nowhere, he said it. "I smell something in the car. You been smoking anything this morning?" I blinked, caught off guard. Smoking? I hadn't touched a cigarette, let alone drugs. I shook my head, confused. "No, sir. There's nothing in here." But he didn't look convinced. "Step out of the car," he said. That's when the panic started to creep in. But I had nothing to hide, right? So I stepped out, heart pounding a little harder than I wanted to admit. He told me he was going to search the car, and against my better judgment, I agreed. I mean, why wouldn't I? I knew there was nothing illegal in there. Minutes passed as he rummaged through my back seat, opening compartments, checking under mats. I stood there trying to calm myself down, thinking this would all blow over in a few minutes, but then everything changed. The officer stood up straight, holding something in his hand. A small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Well, well," he said, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "What do we have here?" I stared at the bag, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. "That's not mine," I said immediately, my voice shaky. "I've never seen that before." He smirked. "Yeah, right, you all say that." I felt my chest tighten, my breathing quicken. This wasn't happening, it couldn't be. But before I could even think straight, he was slapping handcuffs on my wrists, pushing me toward the back of his squad car. I tried to argue, tried to tell him there had to be some mistake, but it was like talking to a brick wall. He wasn't listening. At the station, things only got worse. They booked me, charged me with possession of cocaine, and tossed me into a holding cell. I sat there numb, trying to wrap my head around it. How had this happened? There were no drugs in my car. I don't even touch the stuff. But here I was, sitting in a jail cell, my life crumbling around me. The worst part, it wasn't just about the arrest. It was about what came next. The court date, the lawyer fees, the news spreading to my boss. I lost my job within a week. My boss said they couldn't have someone with pending drug charges on the team, even though I swore up and down it was all a setup. That's when I started digging. I needed answers. I needed to know how this had happened and why. It didn't take long before I started hearing whispers. Stories from other people who had been through the same thing. Traffic stops that ended in arrests for drugs they didn't own. Evidence that seemed to appear out of nowhere. People's lives being ruined for no reason. It turned out, these cops had a pattern. They were making arrests to hit quotas, planting drugs in cars during routine stops, and building fake cases. I wasn't the first person they'd framed, and I probably wouldn't be the last. It was like some twisted game to them. How many lives could they destroy while padding their arrest records? But proving it, that was the hard part. Everything was stacked against me. The officers had their stories straight, the evidence was solid, and no one was going to believe me over them. I was just another number, another case to shuffle through the system. My lawyer told me we could try to fight it, but the odds weren't great. I could feel my reputation slipping away, bit by bit. Friends stopped answering my calls. People at the grocery store looked at me differently, like I was some kind of criminal. I couldn't believe how fast everything had fallen apart. One minute I'm driving to work, and the next, I'm this. A man framed for a crime I didn't commit, losing everything I'd worked for. And all because of some dirty cops who saw me as an easy target. I'd like to say there was a happy ending, that we found a way to expose them, that I cleared my name. But the truth? It wasn't that simple. I'm still fighting it, still trying to piece my life back together. Every day is a reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control, how fragile our lives really are. It's been months now, and I'm still dealing with the fallout. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get my life back, if anyone will believe me. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never trust a traffic stop again. And I'll never stop fighting to prove what really happened that day. Because it wasn't just a traffic stop, it was the moment my life was stolen from me, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get it back. It all started with one moment, one split-second decision that at the time I thought was the right thing to do. But now I wish I had just kept driving. I was on my way home from work, stopped at a red light, when I saw it. A man being slammed into the pavement by a police officer. The guy didn't even look like he was resisting, but the cop had his knee pressed into the back of his neck, forcing his face into the concrete. It was brutal. Something in me snapped. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and started recording. People always say you should document these things, right? Hold them accountable, make sure there's evidence. So that's what I did. I filmed the whole thing, even as the cop noticed me glaring with this look that made my stomach twist. I didn't think much of it. I figured I was just a bystander, someone who happened to catch a bad moment on camera. But after I uploaded the video, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Like the way that same cop seemed to be everywhere I went. When I was driving to work, he'd be parked a few blocks over. When I'd grab coffee at the corner shop, his patrol car would pull up, just watching. The first time he pulled me over, I thought it was a coincidence. He claimed I was speeding, but I wasn't. I'm careful about stuff like that. Still, I didn't argue. I couldn't afford a ticket, so I just kept quiet and took it. But then it happened again, and again. Always the same cop. Always for some bullshit reason. Rolling through a stop sign, having a broken tail light, which wasn't broken. It was like he was looking for reasons to mess with me, and each time his tone got darker, more aggressive. He'd linger by my car window longer than necessary, staring, smirking, making my skin crawl. Then, the notes started showing up. At first I thought it was just some kids playing a prank. I'd come out to my car in the morning and there'd be a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. The first one just said, "I see you." I laughed it off even though it gave me a weird feeling, but the notes didn't stop, they got worse. "Watch your back," one said. "You think you're smart, don't you?" said another. By the time I found the third note, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely open it. That one wasn't a threat. It was a photo. A photo of me, taken from outside my apartment window, while I was asleep in bed. I didn't know what to do. I went to the station, tried to file a complaint, but the officers just shrugged me off. "Must be some kids," they said. "We'll look into it." But they didn't. I knew they wouldn't. I could see it in their eyes. They knew exactly what was going on, but none of them were going to do a damn thing about it. They were all covering for him. The harassment escalated. Every time I left my apartment, I felt eyes on me. I started taking different routes home from work, trying to shake the feeling of being followed, but it didn't help. He was always there, somewhere, watching. One night, I was driving back from a late shift, and there he was again, trailing me. At first, I thought maybe it was just paranoia, but as I made my way down side streets and quiet roads, he stayed on me. I pulled into a gas station thinking maybe I could lose him, but as soon as I stepped out of the car, he pulled up next to me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he rolled down his window. "Out late tonight, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And better be careful. Dangerous out here." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, got back in my car, and drove off. But the whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. I was terrified to even go inside, thinking maybe he'd be waiting for me in the parking lot. Maybe he'd follow me all the way up to my apartment. Maybe. The next morning, my tires were slashed, all 4 of them. I couldn't prove it, but I knew who it was. I knew he was sending me a message, letting me know that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, he could get to me, and no one would believe me. I tried to tell friends, but they thought I was overreacting. Cops don't do that, they said. You're just stressed. But I wasn't imagining it. This was real, and every day it got worse. The final straw came one night when I heard footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate. At first I thought maybe it was just one of the neighbors, but when I peeked through the peephole, my blood ran cold. There he was, standing in the hallway, looking right at my door. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, too scared to even breathe. But after what felt like an eternity, he finally walked away. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag that night and left. I don't know where I'll go next, but I do know one thing. I'll never feel safe again. Not as long as he's out there, watching. It's funny, isn't it? How we're told that the police are supposed to protect us. But sometimes they're the ones we need protecting from. I've always thought of myself as the cautious type. You know, the kind of guy who plays by the rules, never speeds, never talks back to a cop, and always makes sure the seatbelt's buckled. So, when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror that night, I figured it was just a routine stop. I'd been driving home after a late shift, and yeah, I was tired, but swerving? No way. I pulled over, rolled down my window, and waited, just like you're supposed to. The cop approached, flashlight shining straight into my eyes, blinding me. "License and registration," he barked. I fumbled for my wallet, handed over the documents, and waited for him to ask if I knew why I'd been stopped. But that question never came. Instead, he ordered me out of the car. No explanation, no nothing. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Out of the car, now," he repeated. I stepped out, confused as hell. That's when things went sideways. He grabbed my arm, twisted it behind my back, and before I knew it, I was handcuffed and thrown into the back of his cruiser. My heart was pounding. I hadn't done anything wrong. What the hell was happening? As we pulled away, I tried to get answers. "What's going on? Why am I being arrested?" He didn't answer, just stared ahead, driving down some dark road I didn't recognize. We weren't heading to the station, I knew that much. The streets got emptier, more desolate, until we were in the middle of nowhere. It hit me then. This wasn't normal. I tried to calm myself down, to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they thought I was someone else, but deep down I knew better. We pulled up to a large, rundown warehouse. The kind of place where bad things happen. The kind of place no one's supposed to know about. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The cop still didn't answer. He yanked me out of the car and dragged me inside. My stomach twisted with fear. I hadn't done anything wrong, but none of that seemed to matter. Inside the warehouse, the place was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. There was another guy waiting there. Another cop, this one even bigger, arms crossed like he was ready for a fight. The first cop shoved me into a chair, handcuffs still tight around my wrists. "Do you know why you're here?" the bigger one asked, his voice cold. "No, I don't," I stammered. He smirked. "We've been keeping an eye on you, Ryan." "What are you talking about?" I protested, panic rising in my chest. "I haven't done anything wrong." They didn't care. The bigger cop leaned in, close enough that I could smell the stench of his breath. "You've been making waves in the wrong places. We don't like people who ask too many questions." "What? You've got the wrong guy. I don't know what you're talking about." That's when it started. They began asking questions about things I had no knowledge of. Crimes, names, places I'd never heard of. They kept demanding answers, and when I couldn't give them what they wanted, the real horror began. They didn't beat me, not at first. No, they were smarter than that. They knew how to inflict pain without leaving marks. It started with threats, then escalated to slamming my head against the cold concrete wall, using methods that would never be traced back to them. I could feel myself breaking, mentally, physically, but I had no answers for them. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time blurred in that hellhole. All I knew was that every time I failed to give them the answers they wanted, the torture got worse. One of them pulled out a knife, running it along my cheek just enough to let me feel the cold metal against my skin. He grinned, the kind of grin that said he'd done this before. "You're not walking out of here unless you start talking," the bigger one growled. It hit me then like a gut punch. These weren't cops doing their jobs. They were off the grid, taking people like me to settle personal scores. Maybe they thought I was someone else. Maybe I just pissed off the wrong person. But either way, I wasn't getting out of here alive unless I found a way to escape. They left me alone for a while, probably to mess with my head. My wrists throbbed from the cuffs, and my entire body ached, but my mind was racing. I scanned the room looking for anything I could use. In the corner, I spotted a toolbox. If I could just get to it. When they came back, I played along, gave them vague answers, said what they wanted to hear. It bought me a few minutes, just enough time. The moment their backs were turned, I lunged for the toolbox, grabbing a hammer. I swung it with every ounce of strength I had left, hitting one of them square in the jaw. He crumpled to the ground, and I didn't wait around to see if he'd get back up. I ran out the door into the night, blood pounding in my ears. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I kept running. I didn't know where I was, didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away from that place, from those men who weren't just cops, they were monsters. I ran until I collapsed in the dirt, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in pain. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I found the strength to keep going. I had to. I made it to a nearby town and stumbled into a gas station, barely able to speak. The clerk called the police, the real ones this time. I was taken to the hospital, then questioned about what had happened. But here's the thing, those cops, the ones who took me, they were gone. No records, no trace of them ever being there. The warehouse, empty, just an abandoned building with no signs of the nightmare I'd endured. No one believed me. Not really. They wrote it off as a crazy story, maybe a mix-up. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I knew better. Those men are still out there, and I'll never forget their faces, or forget their... I'd never been inside a police station before that night, and I sure as hell didn't think my first time would be like this. I'd always thought of myself as careful, minding my own business, doing what I was supposed to do. But when they brought me in, everything changed. My hands were shaking. The fluorescent lights overhead too bright, too cold. It all started when I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had just left my friend's apartment, walking down a street I'd been down 100 times before. Sirens blared in the distance, and I didn't think anything of it until 2 cop cars came screeching to a halt right in front of me. "Stop! Hands up!" one of the officers yelled, guns drawn like I was some kind of criminal. I froze. I hadn't done anything, so I figured there was a misunderstanding. Maybe they were looking for someone else, but that hope vanished the second they grabbed me, slammed me against the car, and cuffed my wrists. I kept asking, "What's going on?" I didn't do anything. But they wouldn't answer. They just shoved me into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut like a prison gate. The ride to the station was a blur. I couldn't figure out what the hell was happening. My heart was pounding, and every worst-case scenario flashed through my mind. I hadn't broken any laws, hadn't even jaywalked. But somehow, I was caught in the middle of something bigger than me. When we got to the station, they dragged me into an interrogation room. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. 2 officers came in. One of them, Officer Jameson, had this smug look on his face, like he'd already decided I was guilty. "We know you were there," he started, pacing back and forth in front of me. "You're not walking out of here unless you start telling us the truth." I had no idea what he was talking about. "I don't even know what this is about." "What do you mean, there? Where was I supposed to be?" Jameson slammed his fist on the table, making me jump. "Don't play dumb with me, Miranda. You were at the scene of the robbery." What? I wasn't... I tried to explain, but he cut me off. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We have witnesses, footage. We know it was you. Just admit it. My mind raced. I hadn't done anything. I wasn't anywhere near a robbery, but they were talking like they already had me locked up. That's when I realized they didn't care if I was innocent. They just wanted someone to blame, someone to take the fall. I shook my head. You've got the wrong person. I don't know anything about a robbery. Jameson leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. Listen, you can make this easy on yourself, or you can make it worse. Confess, and maybe we cut you a deal. Keep denying it, and we're going to make sure you're behind bars for a long time. I didn't do it, I whispered, my voice shaking. They didn't like that answer. The other officer, Davis, stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. What about your brother? You know, we found some interesting things when we ran his name. Seems like he's been hanging around some shady people. Drugs, maybe. Could be enough to get him locked up for a while. My blood went cold. My brother had his issues, but he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't mixed up in anything like that. But they were dangling him in front of me, using him as leverage. I could feel the trap closing in. If you don't sign this confession, Davis continued, pulling out a piece of paper, we'll bring him in. We'll arrest him tonight. He's got priors, right? That'll be enough to keep him behind bars for a while. I was cornered, and they knew it. I could see it in their eyes. They were enjoying this. I had no idea what to do. If I signed the confession, I'd be admitting to something I didn't do, something I wasn't even involved in. But if I didn't, they were going to ruin my brother's life. I stared at the paper in front of me, my heart pounding in my ears. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck. They had me. They knew it, and I knew it. Tears blurred my vision as I looked up at Jameson. Please, you can't do this. Jameson smirked. We're just doing our job, Miranda. You should have thought about that before getting involved with the wrong people. I wanted to scream, to shout that I was innocent, that this was all a mistake. But I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. No one would believe me. And now, they were threatening the only person I cared about. I grabbed the pen, my hand trembling as I held it over the paper. But then something clicked. My fear gave way to a surge of anger. Why should I let them do this? Why should I let them take everything from me? They didn't have any real evidence, just lies and intimidation. I dropped the pen. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'm not signing it. Jameson's smirk disappeared. What did you say? I said I'm not signing it. I'm not confessing to something I didn't do. He stared at me, his jaw tight, and for a moment I thought he was going to lose it. But instead, he stepped back and glanced at Davis. They exchanged a look, one that sent a chill down my spine. Fine, Jameson said, his voice low. Have it your way. We'll just take your brother in tonight. They left the room after that, leaving me alone in the cold, silent room. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, wondering what they were doing, if they were really going to arrest my brother. But the next thing I knew, the door opened again, and a different officer walked in, one I hadn't seen before. He looked at me, then at the confession on the table. You're free to go, he said, his voice flat. What? I blinked, confused. The charges have been dropped. You're free to go. I wanted to ask why, but I didn't care anymore. All I knew was that I was getting out of there, and I wasn't about to question it. I grabbed my things and left without looking back. Later, I found out that an attorney had gotten involved, someone who saw through the lies and intimidation tactics. The truth finally came out, but the damage was done. I had been forced into a nightmare I never expected, and it left me shaken to my core. I don't trust the system anymore, not after what they did. And even though I got out, I still feel like I'm trapped in that room, forced to make an impossible choice. I'll never forget the way they looked at me. like I was nothing but a pawn in their game. And I'll never forgive them for what they put me through. I didn't think much of it at first, just a minor argument, one of those things that happen when you're stressed and tired. I had cut across a parking lot too fast, trying to beat traffic, and nearly clipped Officer Barrett's patrol car as he pulled out. I slammed on the brakes, he honked, and we exchanged a few choice words through our windows. It was a quick back and forth, nothing too serious, and I drove off, thinking that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day I was walking my dog around the neighborhood when I saw Barrett's cruiser parked down the street. He wasn't pulling anyone over, wasn't responding to a call, just sitting there, staring. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was on patrol, maybe I was being paranoid. But the day after that I saw him again, this time at the end of my street. Same thing, just sitting there. It started to feel less like a coincidence and more like something deliberate. I didn't want to believe it, but it became harder to ignore when the traffic stops began. Barrett pulled me over 3 times in 1 week, each time for something ridiculous. A cracked taillight that wasn't cracked, speeding when I was barely going over the limit, or failure to signal when I knew I had. Every time he took his sweet time writing the ticket, staring me down with this smug smile that made my skin crawl. I complained, of course, took the tickets to court, argued that they were bogus. But in a small town like this, the police have each other's backs, and the judge was quick to side with Barrett. No one dared to stand up to him, not even me. And then he started showing up at my house. The first time he came by under the pretense of a safety check. Said someone had reported a suspicious person near my property. I didn't buy it for a second, but I wasn't going to argue. I let him in, watched as he wandered through my living room, glancing at family photos, opening and closing cabinets for no reason. It was clear he wasn't looking for anything. He was just making himself comfortable, showing me that he could come and go as he pleased. That's when I knew this wasn't just some petty grudge. Over the next few weeks it got worse. He'd show up unannounced, walking into my backyard, checking in during his patrols. Sometimes he'd pull into my driveway and just sit there, engine running, his eyes fixed on my house. Other times I'd spot him in his cruiser at the grocery store or outside my workplace, always just there, watching. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted, only to find my front door cracked open. My heart sank as I stepped inside, my mind racing with the possibility of a break-in. But nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place except for a single note on my kitchen counter. It wasn't much, just a few words scrawled in messy handwriting. Be careful. I knew exactly who left it. I reported it to the police, but I might as well have been talking to a brick wall. The officers at the station all gave me the same look, the one that said, "Good luck getting anyone to listen." Barrett was untouchable in this town, and everyone knew it. Complaining would only make things worse, and it did. The next day, Barrett pulled me over again. This time, he didn't even bother pretending it was about traffic laws. He stepped out of his cruiser, leaned into my window, and said, "You don't learn, do you?" His hand rested on his gun as he stared me down, his voice low and menacing. "I told you to be careful." I couldn't take it anymore. I was furious, but I was also terrified. He had me cornered, and no one else in town seemed willing to help. It wasn't just about the tickets or the stops anymore. It was about control. Barrett wanted to teach me a lesson, and he wasn't going to stop until I was completely under his thumb. I started locking every door and window, double-checking them every night before bed. My dog, usually so calm, began barking at the slightest noise. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. Every time I saw a cop car, my stomach twisted into knots, expecting to see Barrett behind the wheel. One night after weeks of this nightmare, I heard a knock on the door. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting, and my gut told me not to answer. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a pounding. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands shaking. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. "Someone's at my door. I think it's Officer Barrett." There was a pause, and then the operator's voice dropped, quiet and hesitant. "Stay on the line. We're sending someone over." Minutes later, 2 cruisers pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing. Barrett was nowhere to be seen. The officers knocked and I let them in, explaining everything. How Barrett had been harassing me, how he had left that note, how I was afraid he'd come back. One of the officers glanced at his partner, then turned back to me. "We'll handle it," he said, but I could tell by his tone that nothing would change. Barrett wasn't just another cop in this town. He was the law, and no one was going to stand up to him. After that night, I knew I had to leave. Staying meant living in fear every day, waiting for Barrett to make his next move. I packed up, left town, and didn't look back. Even now, miles away, I still can't shake the feeling that he's watching. That somehow he's still got eyes on me, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I'll never be free of him. Because people like Barrett, they don't stop. They don't let go.